Well, this is a very painful situation, and I'm sorry that this has, entered into his family. Is probably a divisive subject. But like Dan's parents, many people are subject to disinformation when they simply want to connect with friends and peers, as Dan's parents want to, or if they want to access information. And it makes a lot of sense that people, especially during pandemic, when there's such intense and unprecedented crisis, events happening, lockdowns, public health measures. It is overwhelming. And it is also surreal in some ways, right? Like none of us 5 years ago could have predicted that we would have spent a year and a half in effective lockdown, and that flights would come to close to a halt, and that so many people would suffer and die from this virus. So the fact that this is an unprecedented situation and that people are at home or looking for information online is a combination that is very fruitful for those who want to spread disinformation. And it's very sad because the motives behind these actors can be commercial, right? They may simply want to sell something under the guise of offering a solution just to become wealthy. Or they may want to sow divisions in society, which is also a clear agenda that we see reflected in some of the COVID disinformation. Or they may simply be convinced that there are a lot of harms in what many people, including leadership, see as a solution, the vaccines. What doesn't help is that WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, is completely inaccessible for others. So, for example, you and I, if we're not part of this group, don't have access to what Dan's parents are seeing. And so there is no oversight, essentially. And in a very different context, I experienced that when I was heading the election observation mission in Kenya. Nobody really trusted sharing their voice and their opinions with many people. So particularly these end-to-end encrypted messenger apps that would allow for further spreading at that time to many, many people, Telegram, WhatsApp, were very popular. And rumors that spread there were actually, I think, more persuasive for people. And they ended up going into further extremes because nobody was really verifying or offering an alternative point of view. So we have a couple of specifics here that explain the appeal of disinformation and the fact that there are few people to offer another perspective. It's a worrying trend that we will have to deal with, and that in low trust societies where there generally is low trust, maybe in authorities and in media, is even more easy to spring root.
Well, Dan, I mean, your concerns are well founded, and thank you for pointing them out. But firstly, I want to think about the positive. So you talk about your parents using WhatsApp. It's a great thing that parents have been able to use WhatsApp and communication tools, which have been a lifeline through the last 18 months or so. And we all have the responsibility to ensure that that lifeline is a force for good and it continues to be a force for good, but recognizing some of the risks that are associated with it. And that brings me on to the negative, which you rightly point out. We know in the digital age, information, which includes misinformation and disinformation, just travels faster. And we at Vodafone have not been strangers to this phenomena. We've had a lot of conspiracy theories in relation to 5G and COVID, to the extent that people were burning down our base stations in some countries. So really taken to the extreme. So we are very aware of the need to ensure that there is reliable information and we are able to limit the unreliable information. So there is good news because there is a partial solution, and clearly though partial, there is a piece of legislation that is currently being assessed called the Digital Services Act. And this will create more responsibilities for large online platforms to prevent the sharing of illegal content, primarily. But we also believe that this should be extended to harmful forms of dis and misinformation. But finally, I would say we have to be a little bit realistic here as well. The example you gave, which is very pertinent, relates to WhatsApp. WhatsApp is a private communication channel, and there's only so much you can do in terms of monitoring, and what goes on in WhatsApp you can't, in fact, monitor because of the privacy and confidentiality of communications. So the proactive steps that can be taken in that regard are somewhat limited. So it's really important that all of us, whatever our generation, we do take the responsibility on ourselves to look out for misinformation, disinformation, to get the digital skills which allow us to differentiate between fact and fiction. And using those skills, we will be able to embrace these tools which are so positive and as I said, have been a lifeline for us in the last 18 months and continue to be a force for good for all of us.
Well, Tomasz is absolutely right to be very concerned. And I think his comments are very insightful, actually, because a lot of people don't realize the extent to which data about them is harvested when they surf online, when they buy something online, when they post or like something online. And the fact that this data is not only collected by the social media and advertising giants like YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, but rather that they are sold and packaged in new ways to develop further the profiles that exist online about people and sell them for indeed different uses. So that idea of mission creep or a lack of transparency is really important. I don't know if any of the people watching have ever gone onto the cookies page where they can select which type of data tracking is acceptable, and the amount of choices you have to make before visiting one website is often in the tens, if not more, of trackers that you can turn on and off. And many people, for understandable reasons, don't have time or don't want to choose to spend time turning those off. So the majority of people are in one way or another profiled. Data about them is collected and repurposed and sold. And it is very important that we do not rely on people's own agency only because they are in a very asymmetrical power relationship vis-a-vis the Facebooks of this world, or indeed those who are going to then repurpose the data as, for example, training data for AIs with possible malign intent, like discrimination or violation of people's human rights. And so it is important, particularly on the part of democratic governments, that there are rules of the road and that we do not retroactively regret having let this data brokering business go completely unregulated with all the devastating consequences. And the whole example that Tomasz mentions, you know, being an individual in a country where, for example, homosexuality is forbidden, and then being labeled as though one is, you know, attracted to people of the same sex, could really have devastating consequences. But there are also less devastating consequences that could still be very much undesired and harmful, like micro-targeting of political ads, or like profiles being made that already allege what your views are on key issues. So there are many reasons to be concerned, both close to home and further away from home.
Well, Tomasz, firstly, I say you might be in the minority in that many others were less concerned, but I think your fears are absolutely spot on, and ones which we should take very seriously, not just in terms of the specific examples that you gave, but more broadly about how our data is used going forward. And you know, as we move into a world where the industrial economy is based on the exploitation and the valuation of data, as a European economic bloc, we need to ensure that European data is processed and managed in a way that delivers value within the European continent. But going back to the specifics, though, of your concerns, I think that it is clear that there are ever increasingly sophisticated tools that are being used to profile customers. Now, this is especially the case where you have an internet ecosystem, which a significant part of it has been built around not taking any money from end users, but using the value of the profiling of those customers to generate value in a multi-sided market. Not something that we at Vodafone have done, and even where we have looked into how to use customer data, we've always stepped away from any what I would call micro profiling of customers and done it in a much more broader set of profiling. But with AI, the risks are increasing, and so Thomas, you appear to be ahead of the game in recognizing the risk that the combination of AI with big sets of data might generate. And slightly ironic for a company like Vodafone, which is often called for the removal of regulation, that again, in this case, there is a regulatory approach which is correct and which is necessary. We have GDPR, which already gives a good amount of protection in relation to people's data. And now the European Commission is proposing an AI Act, which will limit the ways AI can be used. And most specifically, it will ensure that the use of AI is done in an ethical and human-centric way. Now, there's a lot of road to cover to define what human-centric and what ethical actually means. But the starting point is clearly a good one, to ensure that AI is used as a force for good, to enhance our societies, to make our societies more efficient, more effective, hopefully also more green in the future. We know that AI will have a strong role to play there. And such opportunities that are in front of us cannot be jeopardized by people like yourself rightly having concerns about how their own data is being used. if everyone has that same level of concern and people start to switch off their devices or turning off their digital services, we won't make the progress which we see ahead of us. So really correct concerns, and yes, the regulatory approach is going to be important, and it needs to be defined. There's a long way to go, but we see the progress being made.
Well, I think it's very good of Lorenz to be aware that there are others who are in a different age and different skills category, but that are on the same social media platforms. I think there are two ways to look at this. I mean, I also have parents who did not grow up with the internet. Maybe they're a little bit older than Lorenz's parents. And on the one hand, my parents are just online a lot less. So they still resort to, the newspaper, the 8 o'clock news, news programs, other types of information. But then if they go online, indeed, they are less aware of what motives might be or how easy it is to be confronted with disinformation or other kinds of falsehoods. Having said all this, whether young or old, I think there is a systematic asymmetry in the ability to understand why we are seeing what we're seeing. There's just not enough transparency. And even if there would be theoretical transparency, so for example, for researchers, the average person probably would have to invest a lot of time and skills to understand why they're seeing what they're seeing. So I do think that when given a choice between the individual internet user or the regulator, we really do have to look to more clear rules of the road on transparency, liability, accountability, so that we have clearer expectations, not only of what content companies allow people to see, but also the ways in which that content may come to them through data profiles, through botnets. They could be manipulated with a commercial motive, or rather organically. There are so many ways in which content spreads on the internet, and I think most people don't want to be tricked. They don't want to have somebody lying about a product that they're selling, or normally people are interested in knowing, am I looking at an ad or am I looking at an objective piece of journalism? That is not always clear online, and particularly for those older generations. So it is essential that there are clear rules of the road for everybody, and we have to look to democratic governments to create those rules.
Well, Lorenz, yeah, it's a very interesting observation. Firstly, one which, if I'm honest, confuses me slightly, because I'm not sure when you talk about the older generation, are you talking about me or are you talking about my parents? I suspect there might be multiple generations that we're talking about here. I like to think I'm relatively comfortable using digital technologies, and maybe it's more the generation above me, which might be potentially 2 generations above you, Lorenz, but let's leave that to one side. Because it is an issue for all generations. And I think there might be a belief among the younger generation that they're better equipped to deal with misinformation, and they have more of the skills. But also what we see is they're more exposed to misinformation and disinformation because they're using digital tools much more. So this is a question for all. But really to focus on the older generation, yes, it is again about digital skills. It's difficult to be broad or more specific than that. It is across the piece. People need to get comfortable with using digital solutions in all aspects of their life, whether they're young, whether they're old. I mean, we at Vodafone, our foundation has announced a 20 million investment to reach 16 million learners by 2025. We think that's really important, but we also have tailored solutions just for the older generation. We have apps which are specifically designed to help the old people get online. So yes, digital skills is really important. The only thing I would add to that general statement is, in addition to skills, it's a mindset. And we need to have people have the mindset to be aware of the risks that they're dealing with. I mean, the moment we talk about this and misinformation, deep fakes are all around us. You watch something, you no longer know if it's true or not. And whilst having cynicism and skepticism sometimes it goes too far, we do need to have a level of that to make sure we are thinking, am I looking at something real? Am I looking at something fake? And with the combination of a mindset which is open to the idea of things not being as they seem, and also then the advanced digital skills to know how to deal with that, I do think we have the chance to move this forward. But the great thing is that people like yourself just are aware of this, and just by being aware, drive the conversation, and just by driving the conversation, it opens up opportunities to solve the problem.